Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 113, May 15th to May 21st, 1863. Last week, we talked a good amount about the moves leading up to our events this week in Mississippi. Grant is able to break through at Port Gibson, establishing his beachhead on the Confederate side of the river. McPherson is so-so at Raymond, and Jackson is neutralized as a threat to the Federal rear. We said goodbye to Stonewall Jackson, the rebel general dying of pneumonia at Guinea Station in Virginia. We concluded Marmaduke's move into Missouri, as well with his escape back into Arkansas. This week, we are going to spend the entire time in Mississippi talking about the Battle of Champion Hill and the Big Black River. Before we get into that, though, let's talk a little bit about the Patreon. And as we have mentioned, we do have a Patreon episode that revolves around Chancellorsville. That's another picture slideshow. And that will be showing the first day's battlefield there. I think a lot of folks probably, if they've been to Chancellorsville, certainly they've been probably to where Stonewall Jackson has been wounded there by the Visitor Center. They probably where the Union Army makes their stand on the third day. But I bet you probably drove right past the first day's battlefield, and maybe you stopped, maybe you didn't, but I made sure to take a couple pictures just to show you what that looks like. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. And of course, the proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show, and they are greatly appreciated. When we left off last week, things are going very well for Grant. He is finally going to be able to get at Vicksburg after all the failed attempts. What was more, he had told the War Department that he would be unreachable due to his strike into Mississippi. The campaign would be conducted his way. His way included several strikes and defeats of the Confederate Army, although one was probably unplanned at the Battle of Raymond. One of the main advantages of the southern approach to the city was that there were good roadways potentially able to support an army. As opposed to coming from the north, there were several rivers that could be used by the defenders to slow and advance an army. Pemberton had already done so in late 1862. There was one exception, and that was the Big Black River, which runs in a kind of diagonal line, cutting down actually to Grand Gulf. Grand Gulf, of course, is where Grant originally thought he was going to be landing to get at the Confederate side of the river, but he is thwarted by the defenses there. I'll hopefully post a map to the website for clarity. I think I've already posted a couple that depict the various stops in our campaign, but of course, along with this episode, I'll try to post another. That way, we get the full picture. What we should keep in mind, though, is that Grant now has his Army of the Tennessee sitting ready to turn and face the Big Black River and whatever the Confederates managed to muster. If you think that Pemberton and Johnston are going to come up with an intricate plan, then unfortunately you will be sadly disappointed. Pemberton is going to be described after this campaign in a letter simply by saying indecision, indecision, indecision. Remember, I mentioned that the Southern Army needs a battlefield leader, and with both Pemberton and Johnston, neither of which I think can be described as that, they're going to be a little short-handed. Just to backtrack a little bit, we need to talk about some of the moves that were made following the establishing of the beachhead at Port Gibson. Pemberton, of course, was trying to consolidate his forces at Vicksburg. You remember that Jefferson Davis gave him the directive to defend that city, so he's going to try to follow orders. We're going to talk about the makeup of the armies shortly, but he is going to move his troops out and across the Big Black River, leaving 2 divisions in Vicksburg, which is going to be a mistake, as we will see events unfold. Also notable is the suggestion by William Wayne Loring that the Confederates could hit the Union Army as it marched, flanking them to the south. Pemberton declined this option, and it should also be pointed out that Loring is not going to get along with his superior, similar to his action in the Shenandoah Valley, which will not bode well for future events either. A staff officer will write about the relationship between Pemberton and Loring, which gives us a pretty good insight. There is quite a feud existing between Loring and Pemberton, so far as Loring is concerned. In fact, it amounted to that degree of hatred on the part of Loring that Captain William Barksdale and myself agreed that Loring would be willing for Pemberton to lose a battle, provided he would be displaced. I sat down under a tree and listened to Generals Loring, Tillman, and Featherston engaged in quite an animated conversation, the principal topic being General Pemberton and the affairs of the country in general. They all said harsh, ill-natured things, made ill-tempered jests in regard to General Pemberton, and when an order came from him, the courier who brought it was not out of hearing before they made light of it and ridiculed the plan he proposed. So we're going to see that Pemberton is not having a good time. It's actually very similar to the experience that Braxton Bragg is going to have with his army. So if you're not Robert E. Lee, you're having a tough time at the head of your army. But the question now is what to do with Jackson neutralized. Johnston would send a flurry of suggestions that were not particularly helpful to his subordinates, the last of which would advise Pemberton to move his army north to join his forces. Vicksburg, in that case, would simply have to be abandoned. Now we know Pemberton is not going to do that. He puts so much emphasis on protecting Vicksburg, he leaves too many men, the 2 divisions he leaves behind, in the city. That's actually going to be part of the problem as well, because the 2 divisions are still in the city, and therefore, if he's going to link up with Johnston's army, he's going to have to wait for those divisions to get there. Even if they were with the army, Johnston's last message would not reach Pemberton until it was too late, as we will soon see. Let's pause and discuss the makeup of the armies. I think once again we have given more focus on the armies in the east, but I would like to give the same respect to the armies in the west now. Pemberton's army has several divisions, most of which we have already mentioned. We've already talked about Bowen and his brigade commanders. William Loring commands another division, with brigade commanders being Lloyd Tillman, the commander at Fort Henry, as well as Abraham Buford and Winfield Featherston. Tillman is upset that he was passed over for division command by Bowen, who is in fact his junior. Buford was a Kentucky native and cousin to the Union Bufords. He is going to go on and command in Forrest Cavalry later in the war. Winfield Scott Featherston was known as Old Sweat and had commanded the 17th Mississippi in the Eastern Theater. He will go on to command further in the west. Carter Stevenson has the largest division. Stevenson is going to be woefully devoid of battlefield experience, although it was not for want of trying. He had seen action at Carnifex, but he had missed the major campaigning in the other theaters in which he was stationed. Along with the hero of Chickasaw Bayou, Stephen Dill Lee, he will also have Seth Barton, Alexander Reynolds, and Alfred Cumming. Seth Barton was a native of Fredericksburg and had served as the engineer for Jackson in the Valley. He is going to go on to take over Armistead's brigade in the Eastern Theater. Alexander Reynolds was a West Point graduate, but had been discharged from the Army prior to the war. Cummings we have met before, but importantly, he had only recently arrived, having been wounded at Bloody Lane at Antietam, and has been in brigade command for only a few days, not familiar with his regiments or his officers. John Forney commands a division with Louis Hebert and John Moore, both of whom we have met at Corinth. Forney is going to share with Pemberton an unfounded rise in command, having served at 1st Manassas under Kirby Smith. He will continue to serve throughout the war and move back to Florida at its conclusion. Grant's Army of the Tennessee, we have mentioned, has 3 corps: the 13th under McClernand, the 15th under Sherman, and 17th under McPherson. McClernand has Osterhaus, Andrew Smith, Alvin Hovey, and Eugene Carr. Hovey has brigades under George McGinnis and James Slack. McGinnis was a Mexican War veteran who had settled in Indiana. The Vicksburg campaign will be a sort of apex for his military career, afterwards going on to lesser commands. Slack was a Bucks County, Pennsylvania native who had commanded a regiment during the Island No. 10 campaign. He will go on to hold various commands in the West following Vicksburg. Carr has brigades under William Benton and Michael Lawler. Benton was a Maryland-born Indiana native who served as an enlisted man in Mexico. He will go on to command further in the West at Mobile. Lawler was born in Ireland, but eventually found himself in Illinois, serving in Mexico. He will continue to command in Texas and Louisiana, selling horses after the war. Osterhaus's brigade commanders we already met in Andrew Smith and then Theophilus Garrard, who you might remember as the federal commander at Camp Wildcat all the way back in 1861. McPherson has divisions under Logan and Crocker. Logan has brigades under John Smith, Mortimer Leggett, and John Stevenson. Smith was actually born in Switzerland before moving to America with his family. He was actually the regimental commander of the 45th Illinois. He will go on to division command in future campaigns. Leggett was born in New York, having served on the staff of McClellan earlier in the conflict. He will perform well at Vicksburg and go on to division command. After the war, a company he finds will go on to be part of General Electric. Stevenson was actually born in Stanton, Virginia, moving west later in life. He would go on to various commands, practicing law at the completion of the war. Crocker's division would actually be commanded by Isaac Quinby, his brigades under the already mentioned Sanborn, Samuel Holmes, and George Boomer. Quinby was a native of Rochester, New York, and will be in and out of command due to health complications. George Boomer was a Massachusetts native who had moved west to build bridges across the Mississippi. We have already mentioned some of the men under Sherman's command at Chickasaw Bayou. He has divisions under Frederick Steele, Preston Blair, and James Tuttle. Now Sherman would remain in Jackson to see off any attempts from Johnston, although, as we have mentioned, he is not really a threat. McClernand and McPherson would turn toward Vicksburg, Grant marching out toward the Confederate city. Pemberton, as we have mentioned, was moving south in an effort to cut Grant off, or otherwise come in on his rear like Johnston had suggested. But the march was slow and hampered by indecision. The Confederates stopped for a long amount of time, searching for a crossing of Baker's Creek, when there was clearly an alternative route. Pemberton would be unaware of a bridge close by that could have been used for his purpose. It would not be a sweeping, fast-paced movement, as likely would have been necessary. Thus, the 15th of May was wasted. The column had stopped along the Jackson Road, but some of the troops did not stop marching until 3 a.m., which means they will not be rested. It is important for the battle to understand the geography. Just beyond a body of water called Baker's Creek were 3 roadways. The Raymond Road, which was to the south, the Middle Road, in the middle, of course, and the Jackson Road, which intersected the Middle Road and then swung to the north. These roads were all running east-west, connecting Jackson and, more importantly, Edwards Depot. Edwards Depot sat on the east side of the Big Black River, the last real barrier before Vicksburg. From Edwards Depot, an army could snake its way north of Jackson, where Johnson was forming up. Hold that thought for a moment. Where the Jackson and Middle Roads intersected was known as the Crossroads. A little north of the Crossroads, just off the Jackson Road, was a commanding hill known as Champion Hill, named as such for Sid Champion, a Mexican-American war veteran who was currently serving in the rebel army. On the night of the 15th, the Confederates would bed down, with Loring's men well to the south. John Bowen would be near the Ratliff Road, which would connect into the Raymond Road. Carter Stevenson and his large division would be behind him. Few would be aware that the following day will decide Vicksburg. On the morning of the 16th, John McClernand would begin the march on all three roadways. He had not only his corps, but also the detached division from Sherman of Francis P. Blair. To the south, on the Raymond Road, would advance the division of Andrew Smith. Behind him would be Blair in support. Osterhaus and Carr would advance along the Middle Road. Hovey would advance along the Jackson Road, McPherson and his corps coming in behind him. Early in the morning, Andrew Smith and his division, specifically the brigade under Stephen Burbridge, would make contact with Wirt Adams and his cavalry. Adams was a fully capable cavalry officer and would ride off to inform Pemberton of the contact made by the enemy. Loring and his men would skirmish with the Yankees, action that would see the Confederates driven off. His men would form up near the Ellison House along the Raymond Road. John Bowman and his command would also form into line of battle and begin dueling with the Union artillery. This Yankee artillery, which would include the Chicago Mercantile Battery, would demonstrate their superior range. In fact, Burbridge would write that his men inflicted some casualties and drove the enemy back. But the Federals would be cautious. They were not supposed to bring on a general engagement, at least not until all the pieces were on the board. As you could imagine, coordination between the columns was difficult. McClernand was concerned of being flanked before he had proper support. Osterhaus's division in the center would likewise make contact with Stevenson's division, holding the crucial crossroads. The skirmishing would spark the conversation amongst troops on the Jackson Road that someone was hunting squirrels, but with the increased fire, it was surmised that the squirrels were in fact shooting back. Now Pemberton will have a decision to make, which is a common theme here in these episodes, and unfortunately for him, not the right guy to be making them. He will, on that morning, receive the news that Jackson had fallen and that Joe Johnston was moving north. The suggestion to combine forces also arriving. This seemed to be the only course of action, but it was a little late. The enemy had arrived. Loring would engage in heated discussion with Pemberton on the field. Several wagons were in the way of the army, and their potential retrograde back towards Edwards. It would be at Edwards Depot that they could head north and combine with the rest of the rebels. Alexander Reynolds and his Tennessee regiments had barely received enough sleep. Remember that if you were first in a column, you camped first. Unfortunately, they would have to lead the way now, being first in position for that motion. While this was taking time, the crossroads needed to be held. Stephen Lee and Alfred Cummings would both be positioned here, skirmishing with Osterhaus and the troops of the brigade of Theophilus Garrard. Meanwhile, to the north, the two remaining guns of the Botetourt Battery were on the high ground of Champion Hill. They would be alarmed to notice Alvin Hovey and his Midwestern Division was arriving and forming up before them. Stephen Dill Lee would be the first to understand the peril. He would move his brigade of Alabama troops under fire to the north and form up on the hill without orders. Alfred Cummings would soon join him, Stevenson having to shift his brigades to still hold the key areas. In the meantime, the Federals were getting a prominent line of the battle set up. Hovey, with his brigades of McGinnis and Slack, would be joined by Blackjack Logan and his units. Smith and Leggett would likewise join their comrades. Logan reportedly was asked by his troops if they could remove their knapsacks, to which Logan replied, "No, damn them, you can whip them with your knapsacks on." So the assault on the Confederate left flank would begin. Hovey's division would hit Cummings and his Georgia regiments shortly after they formed to the right of Lee. McGinnis's brigade to the front and Slack's brigade to the flank were too much for the rebels. The Southerners are going to withdraw from Champion Hill in disorder, although the flank held fairly well considering the numbers against them. Not only were the 2 Botetourt artillery pieces captured, but so too were the 2 more guns from an Alabama battery that had joined them. There was much confusion and some heavy hand-to-hand fighting in the withdrawal. Logan's division would press Lee on the left flank in the meantime, Leggett and Smith engaging the Alabama brigade. An attack by the gray-clad men was parried away, with Lee soon realizing that his flank was compromised. 2 of his 5 regiments had been forced to withdraw, so under pressure he would order a retreat. Seth Barton and his brigade of Georgia regiments would arrive on the scene, but too late were they to stabilize the Southern line and provide much-needed aid to Lee on his left. Barton, though, would attack anyway, with 3 regiments, being bloodily repulsed by Smith and Leggett. The Federal brigade of John Stevenson would make its way through the rough terrain and into Barton's flank, where high ground and 2 batteries sat. Before assaulting, amazingly, the lone infantry regiment of the 52nd Georgia would attack, being overwhelmed quickly. Stevenson would push his men forward and capture the guns, inflicting many losses on the gunners. These regiments would include the 32nd Ohio, who had surrendered at Harper's Ferry and thus sought redemption. Barton would report that his brigade loss was 42%, illustrating the unfortunate nature of his attack. Slack would continue down to the crossroads with his 56th Ohio, as well as the 24th and 28th Iowa. They would brush away the small skirmishing companies, a battery, and 2 Georgia regiments. Cummings had left these to protect the key intersection. Unfortunately, only a few companies had been standing in the way of Osterhaus. Hovey and Logan had broken the enemy flank and now had a beautiful opportunity to combine 2 portions of the army. You see, the problem with the Union attack was that they were on 3 different roads, making communication difficult. Combining at the crossroads would give Grant the reins in a dangerous spot for Pemberton. But John McClernand would not take advantage of the situation. Grant and McClernand did not like each other, as we very well know, so the political general would try to keep himself to the letter of the law. He would proceed slowly, as were his orders, and much in the same way Loring reacted to Pemberton, he would not find an opportunity to attack as of yet. Illustrating the communication problems, an order from Grant to attack would not arrive until 2 hours later. So just so we kind of understand the situation here, I don't necessarily think that Champion Hill is too complicated of a battle to really get. We have a key crossroads where there's a road coming in from the east, and then a road that's kind of coming down from the north. There's another road that's a little further south. We kind of talked about that with where Loring is. So let's keep that from our mind right now. But the crucial battlefield situation here is that Champion Hill, that's from the northern approach. That's with Hovey and his division. That's where they were engaged. And now we have McClernand with an opportunity because all the Confederates have shifted down north. He can come in on that roadway that's running from the east. And he does not do that. Unfortunately for Grant, Pemberton had grasped just how dangerous a spot he was in. Bowen's and Loring's divisions were called up in an effort to turn the tide and keep the flank intact. Loring would essentially ignore the order, stating the enemy was enforced to his front and that he would need to pick the right time for a strike. Bowen, on the other hand, would quickly move his 4,500 men up to the crossroads. Francis Cockrell and his Missouri regiments and the mixed brigade of Martin Greene would form relatively perpendicular with the middle road and assault McGinnis and Slack. Both would be forced to withdraw under the new Confederate attack. remember that Bowen's troops are probably the best that the Confederates have. A soldier in Slack's brigade would describe the desperation in the assault. Samuel Hammett was wounded. He was hit in 2 places, once through the right breast and once through the right thigh, and he begged for me to carry him off the field. I picked him up and ran for the nearest place of shelter, and laid him on the shade of a large tree where he was out of danger. I took my canteen and gave him drink and wet his face, and by that time the rebels had got between me and our regiment, and I took my old gun and left them have the contents a few times, and then ran again, not knowing where I was going to. I felt my way as careful as possible through the thick brush and trees. Definitely get the confusion of the attack and these counterattacks that are happening on the field as well. Barton, Cummings, and Lee would be able to reform with reinforcements having successfully arrived. They would put pressure on the other parts of the Union line now, McPherson in need of additional troops. These men would arrive in the form of Marcellus Crocker's division. Sanborn and Boomer would advance down the Jackson Road, followed by 2 more regiments from Samuel A. Holmes' brigade. Holmes would actually be briefly removed from command by McPherson for reportedly drinking, but was reinstated by Grant. Grant, it should be noted, had set up shop near the Champion House up the Jackson Road, most likely because McPherson was the least experienced of his corps commanders. It just so happened that this was exactly the right place to be. Boomer and Sanborn were thrown into the fight just as Bowen's brigade was pushing the remnants of McGinnis and Slack back from the hill and then on the low ground below. Sam Byers, whose account of the battle I have seen quoted in several places, speaks of the fugitives showing their bloodied hands, so they were not called cowards. He goes on to paint a good picture of the combat, being wounded in the process and firing shots into smoky gray masses of men. Cockrell and Greene would see some success in a potential flanking movement, but the Federal line would hold with well-placed artillery by Hovey, which would keep the rebels at bay. Colonel Holmes and his 2 regiments from his brigade would rally the Federals, then falling in behind them. Holmes would call to an officer of the 56th Ohio to collect his stragglers. The officer replied that his men had been fighting and that they were not stragglers. Realizing his mistake, Holmes apologized, saying that indeed there were no stragglers there. Crucially, John Stevenson's brigade is recalled from its flanking position on the Jackson Road. Stevenson had actually managed to be in a position to cut off the rebel retreat. If you remember, this was a leftover from his attack against Confederate artillery and the 52nd Georgia. Manpower being at a premium, though, it was deemed his troops would be necessary if Crocker's division broke. With all the troops deployed in this part of the battlefield, the Confederates could have greatly benefited from 2 things. The first is obvious, and that would be fresh troops from the Loring. The second was ammunition. Reportedly, Division Commander Carter Stevenson had moved Bowen's ammunition train across Baker's Creek, and it is hard to imagine exactly why he did that. In the meantime, Cockrell and Greene would get their cartridges from the dead and dying on both sides, hopeful that reinforcements would arrive in support. Stevenson, of course, is inexperienced in command, so this could partially explain it. There's not really a good explanation, though, as to why he does that, especially in a crucial situation. But if you are told to move one way and then immediately have to respond to an emergency, you might have set things in motion that you can't really pull back, so that could also be part of it too. It would finally be spelled out for William Loring that he would need to send some of his division north, removing it from the strong position on the Coker House Ridge. Abraham Buford's brigade would track along the road toward the crossroads and the fight. It was just in time. Carter Stevenson had reported to Pemberton he was facing some 60,000 men, which was false, but this does illustrate the dire nature the officer thought himself in. The 46th Alabama was actually trapped in the retreat and forced to surrender. Overall, the withdrawal was not going well, the Confederates giving up the same ground they had just fought over. Greene's men were in danger of being flanked by Osterhaus, finally moving forward, led by Garrard and Lindsey's brigade. Bowen would actually pull the 35th Alabama and 12th Louisiana out of line and meet the new threat from the east. The 35th and a battery would check Lindsey's brigade, forcing Michael Lawler and his brigade from Carr's division to jump in on that part of the line. The 12th Louisiana amazingly would charge Garrard's brigade a little to the north of the Middle Road, and would drive them off after a brief hand-to-hand engagement. 2 regiments would hold out against McClernand, but the momentum was entirely on the side of the North. By the time Featherston and his brigade were approaching the battle, the situation was clear. A Confederate staff officer described approaching the battle. On my urging them for God's sake not to fly the field in that manner, would invariably reply that they were all that was left of their company. I extorted and pled with numbers to return, that by their efforts united with those who had gone to their assistance, Loring, that the day would yet be ours, and the tide of battle turned. But nothing but a drawn saber or presented bayonet will halt men fleeing from the battlefield. As I rode on further, I saw large numbers wounded, and in every conceivable manner. The earth in some places red with blood, and here and there a mangled soldier who had ceased to feel either the pain of his wounding or the sight of defeat, and was sleeping the sleep that knows no waking. Pemberton realized the battle was over. Grant and his Federals had possession of the Jackson Road, so escape across Baker's Creek and toward Edwards Depot by that route was impossible. This meant that the Confederates would need to escape via the Raymond Road to the south, and then proceed to the Big Black River, which could be turned into a good defensive line. A.J. Smith's division and Giles Smith of Blair's brigade were pressing toward this southern crossroads, so holding it was imperative. Crucially, Lloyd Tillman and his brigade were there, but had started to move north to join the rest of the army. Pemberton had attempted to countermand the order, but it was only through hard marching that the Confederates returned to their line. This is particularly unfortunate for Tillman, who was killed via an artillery shell that hit near him as he sighted one of his own pieces. Just prior to being hit with a shell, Tillman had commented that he would first take a shot at the enemy because they were trying to ruin his new uniform. A retreat to the river would be on. Fortunately, Samuel Lockett had supervised a bridge built over the creek in this sector, and the ford had become passable. In the darkness, Loring and his division would be lost, and decide that not only was Edwards taken by the enemy, but it was impossible to rejoin Pemberton. Loring being free of Pemberton, I would imagine, had a lot to do with this decision. In a tough march, Loring and his men would move southeast, and eventually actually get back to Jackson. From Jackson, he was able to trek further north and combine with Joseph Johnston. Now, this part of the battle I think is particularly interesting here in the aftermath, that Loring is going to march toward the Union Army, or at least in the general direction that the Union Army was coming from. Remember, Sherman is still coming up from Jackson, so he would rather essentially turn around and face the entire Union Army than continue to serve under Pemberton. So that should tell you exactly how essentially he feels about his commanding officer. Pemberton, though, of course, was not informed of this decision. He reasoned that he needed to wait for Loring at the Big Black. To do this, he would have earthworks manned on the east side of the river, obviously trying to establish a beachhead should his subordinate show up. These works were described by the rebels as ditches, owing to their quality. Bowen and his battle division would be stationed, as well as a fresh brigade under Vaughn, mostly filled with conscripts from East Tennessee. On the 17th, Grant and his army would arrive with Osterhaus and Carr's division in the lead, these men having seen lighter action on the 16th. Michael Lawler's brigade would actually use cover to their advantage, fixing bayonets and charging the enemy after a brief bombardment. Taken by surprise, the Confederates would break and run, the action resulting in 1,750 additional captures. Survivors would escape across a railroad bridge and moored vessels before setting fire to the crossing. Whether he made it out to Johnston or was captured and destroyed by Grant, Loring was deemed lost. The decision now was to withdraw back into the Vicksburg defenses, the siege soon to begin. While riding back into the city, Pemberton would muse that his military career had begun 30-some years before at West Point, and on the 17th it had come to a close. Federals were left with the cleanup of the battle. Here we have a description. It was a horrible picture, and the one that I carry with me to this day. All around us lay the dead and dying, amid the groans and cries of the wounded. Our surgeons came up quickly, and, taking possession of a farmhouse, converted it into a field hospital, and we began to carry ours and the enemy's wounded to the surgeons. There they lay, the blue and the gray intermingled, the same rich, young American blood flowing out into little rivulets of crimson, each thinking he was in the right. The one conscious of it today, the other admitting now it were best the union should be maintained, one and inseparable. The surgeons made no preference as to which should be first treated. The blue and the gray took their turns before the surgeon's knife. What heroes some of those fellows were! With no anesthetic to soothe the agony, but gritting their teeth, they bore the pain of the knife and the saw, while arms and legs were being severed from their bodies. Grant had lost 2,457 casualties compared to some 3,840 or so on the Confederate side, which included much more captured. Both armies saw a higher percentage of losses when it came to those who were actually engaged. Slack and his brigade saw 31% losses, McGinnis saw 26%. Alvin Hovey, when finding the fate of his old regimental command, would ride away weeping. Champion Hill is often overlooked as a decisive battle of the war, but it essentially seals the fate of Vicksburg. Pemberton had opportunities, but those were all wasted, in part by the subpar performance of Carter Stevenson and the lack of cooperation by Loring. Grant saw a lackluster performance from McClernand, and McPherson was more of a bystander during the battle, but victors often have the luxury of overlooking such things. It was now on to Vicksburg, Grant ready to deliver a knockout blow. So we'll call it a day there. This week we had an in-depth look at Champion Hill, as well as the follow-up action at the Big Black River. Next week we're finally going to get to the gates of Vicksburg. Is Grant going to complete his Civil War blitzkrieg, or are the Confederates going to hold fast? Find out next time. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, Patreon, as well as Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.